My name is Clare Martin. I'm living at Walnut Hills Nursing Home, where I've been for about the last 8 years. I was born in Michigan in 1922 with the name of Clare Snyder. Since I have been adopted, my name was changed to Martin. My mother's name was Anna Bauman Snyder, married to Alan Snyder. It should be the purpose of every family to give honor and glory to God in what their legacy is. And so in my case, as I know it, even though our family, both family systems, have never been very influential in areas such as business or medicine, there has always been a very strong interest in church mission and in church mission in various kinds, including the mission field and church planting. And so I would figure that is our legacy, and that is what I'm interested in. I always have been. My grandfather, Abram Snyder, moved from the Bloomingdale, Ontario area to several different places in the United States at probably about 1910. At about 1915, he purchased land in Michigan and in the area where I was born. My father, Alan Snyder, and my grandfather, Abram Snyder, bought the land there in Michigan and then donated some of the land to build a small Mennonite church in that very rural area. And it is in that spectrum that I was born. My mother, Anna Snyder, or her surname was Bauman. The nature of much of that I don't know, because I don't remember anything in terms of my father or my mother. My mother died when I was 3 years of age. And however, out of that marriage union, there were 4 of us children. The oldest, Violet, was 5 years older than I am. And then I had her brother, Royal Snyder. And then me and my youngest sister, Maria Snyder, no longer living, who was 2 years younger. My mother died at the time that Marie was born, or almost at that time. My mother, as I know it, She had been in poor health for a number of years. I think from having contracted the influenza virus at the end of World War I. My mother was a woman of very profound spiritual interests and very much interest in helping other people where she was able to. And my mother also had developed a very close relationship with her younger sister, Lydia, who was 10 years younger. And much of Lydia's spiritual interests were probably adopted from my mother, Anna. Simon Martin grew up in St. Jacobs, Ontario area in an old order Mennonite home, and joined the church. However, almost immediately, he completely backslid from the church because there was no spiritual activity for the young people. And in that setting, Lydia came into the picture and sort of helped him to a little better situation. However, due to the influence of Lydia and the Mennonite church in the local area and some other sources, Simon became genuinely changed and converted. He gave up all of his former life, including leading the young people, possibly in areas of alcohol and so on, and they became active in the local church in terms of youth activity and Bible study, and in such case there was an outstanding spiritual growth. A strong interest in missions, particularly Argentina. In that section of the church, foreign missions was very active already at that time in the early 20s. And with that in mind, Simon and Lydia decided to go to Eastern Mennonite School, now EMU. So with one daughter already, they left for school at Eastern Mennonite School with the total disapproval of his family, and then were at EMU for several years. There, Simon's oldest daughter was born in St. Jacobs, and she went down there to school with them. Simon and Lydia Martin were at Eastern Mennonite School for about 2.5 to 3 years. And then their plans became somewhat interrupted by my mother Anna's very, very sickly condition. With that in mind, Simon Martins moved from Eastern Mennonite School to a small mission church near Shirkston, Ontario, in the year, I believe, at the end of 1924, with their daughter and their one son James, who was born in Virginia. They made that move in recognition that they would be adopting several of us children in the near future. So he moved to Shirkston. Shirkston is close to the Peace Bridge at Buffalo, right almost at the Niagara River. And then they evidently went to Michigan in recognition of my mother's impending death, which took place in early February of 1925. Simon Martins then adopted 3 of us children, and the youngest one, a little baby, was taking care of her grandmother, as far as I know. So Simon Martins then, briefly, that is our first experience that I had of living at Shirkston, of which I know nothing. However, there were the Simon family immediately grew from 2 to 5, and one more by the end of the year. And Simon had made his living in various areas as a mission worker at that time, doing hauling gravel, helping to build the Peace Bridge, and various jobs of that type. And after about a year and a half, then my father had remarried, and we moved back to Lancaster. After about a year and a half or 2 years in the summer, my father died, probably from some kind of, probably from an accident related to agriculture. And after about 1 week of very severe stomach flu, my father died, leaving his wife and 1 young daughter, not yet a year old, and all of us children. So at that point, Simon Martins adopted my oldest sister Violet and me, and changed our name to Martin. Royal was probably adopted by his uncle in Michigan. And so Royal and I, who had grown very close together, were separated from that time on. And Simon Martin, then at that point, I moved back to Shirkston, Ontario for the second time, where Simon was pastoring a mission church along with his wife in a very rural setting and making his own living while pastoring. In 1929, it became necessary for my father to make a move from the small mission church at Shirkston, because that church was, due to location and a large number of Brethren in Christ people living in the area, to close. So by 1930 then, my father moved with his family to the Strasbourg Mennonite Church near the Pioneer Park area of Kitchener, Ontario. And so by early 1930, we made that move, moving from very small acreage of land to a 100-acre farm. We moved in 1930, which was the beginning of the real Depression, the very beginning. So we started farming in 1930 with almost no farm equipment and only a few animals. I recall those years very vividly. It is also true that the first half of probably the years from 1930 to 35 were the most difficult years over most of this country. A few of the summers were very hot and dry. We survived. We had a farm. Mother started a vegetable garden, so we had vegetables, many of which were sold, and we had an apple orchard. However, food you had to buy, most of that we didn't have. Mother started going to market, the Kitchener Waterloo Farmers Market, selling vegetables, baking cookies and other things to sell, and with that revenue, buying many of the things which it was essential to buy. And father's responsibility was to take care of the farm with his family, to take care of the farm, but he felt his greatest responsibility was the ministry at that local church. I well remember that. Life was simple. It had to be it was simple. However, we always had church Sunday morning and Sunday school. In those days, we always had church Sunday evening, and we always had prayer meeting Wednesday evening. And we had a local one-room school that we attended. That's where I got my education, most of it. One-room school, one teacher, with 8 grades. And if I remember right, I think there's a stove in the middle of the room. I'm not sure about the location, but the games you play nowadays at the big schools, we didn't have. I knew nothing about basketball until I got to Goshen College. Didn't know there was such a thing. And that was where I got my education, my formal education prior to Goshen College, in a period of about 6-7 years' time. Church life to us didn't seem to be particularly formal for several reasons. At the end of every year in Sunday school, we all got a prize. And it was about always a book from some famous missionary or other that they had picked up at the bookstore in Kitchener. That was the beginning, the very beginning of the library I developed over the years then. I remember particularly written by John Bunyan, one by a famous Christian lady from India, and so on. In our setting, it seems to me, as I recall, that there was a very, well, you could call it a sort of an effective type of missionary emphases going on. We also, in those early years, and about, we had every quarter, a group of 4 or 5 rural churches got together on a Sunday afternoon and Sunday evening for a quarterly missions conference for those who were interested in attending. And I attended a number of those with some other members of our family. My father always took them in. And a big value of that was that we got to recognize, at least in my case, I learned to recognize certain prominent church leaders that otherwise we'd have never learned to know, that maybe I learned to recognize years later.
Clare didn't have a lot of possessions. His most valuable possessions were his memorabilia from when he was little growing up, and also his books. Those were very important to him, and that was hard as we had to go through the books and sort out and decide where is all this going to go, and what can he have at the retirement home, what really needs to go to Save and Serve. He wanted some things donated to Amish Minute Heritage Center, some other places. that was a tough transition for Clare.
And Clare always had a very sharp mind. He still does. I mean, he's very intelligent, and when you talk to him, or when you think of him, I remember when he was an Amish taxi driver, and he would be sitting in his Buick, waiting on someone, and you would see Clare with a book, and he was sitting there reading. It was downtime, so why not read? Occasionally, you'd see him take a nap, but that's okay too. But the interesting part was he was always reading. And when I visited him in Walnut Hills, when he was first there, he would be out in the lounge and he would be sitting with a book. TV was on, but he had a book in his hand.
Perhaps one of the greatest factors in many of these activities going on at that time, like the mission board meetings, the Sunday school conferences and so on, had their origin in the Ontario Mennonite Bible School, it was called. It was a winter Bible school, and where you could go for 3 weeks or 6 weeks, or maybe for 12 weeks. The only winter Bible school that the Mennonite Church ever had that lasted for 12 weeks. And the emphasis there from the very beginning was a very strong missionary emphasis, which came out of the Great Awakening of the Mennonite Church. And there was a very strong emphasis on missions and on Bible study, particularly as they related to such practical things as Sunday school teaching and also summer Bible school teaching. The summer Bible school movement was very strong at that time in that community. Very strong and very influential. In fact, the summer Bible school was used to start new Sunday schools and new churches. And I had the opportunity to attend the winter Bible school. It was cheap. It was held at the church, and very valuable for me in its place.